Germany's coalition government collapsed dramatically with Chancellor Olaf Scholz sacking his finance minister Christian Lindner on Wednesday evening, paving the way for snap elections early next year. In this video, we will explain why the coalition is fighting again and what could happen. Background of the coalition. Before we start, if you haven't done so yet, please remember to subscribe and click on the bell to stay up to date and be notified when we publish new videos. Let's start with a reminder of how the so-called traffic light coalition came to power. These are the last federal elections in Germany in September 2021. I saw Olaf Scholz, Scholz's Social Democratic Party, or SPD, emerge as the largest party for the first time since 2002. But to form a government with a parliamentary majority, the SPD had to turn to the third place, the Greens and the Liberal Democratic Party, or FDP. It took 2 months of intense negotiations before an agreement was struck, which somehow foreshadowed some of the challenges that the government was going to have to face. Scholz, at the head of the SPD, naturally became the German Chancellor. The co-leader, Robert Habeck, became Vice-Chancellor, Minister of Economy and Climate, and Minister of the FDP. Christian Lindner became Minister of Finance. However, any common ground that was reached within the framework of the coalition, the agreement faded rather quickly, and the three parties have been in conflict for much of their mandate, as well as transactions after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Months of taking office had to face the many challenges that arose from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022. The coalition's popularity has since crashed, and a recent poll for ARD showed that 85% of Germans are less satisfied or not at all satisfied with the current government. Individually, the Greens, the SPD, and the FDP in all the polls are very bad, which we will come back to later. Early federal elections. The early federal elections are now one of the main challenges facing the government at the moment and are causing arguments inside. Lies the dire state of the German economy. Germany's GDP is expected to stagnate this year after contracting last year, and the IMF forecasts mega growth of 0.8% for 2025, the weakest expected performance among the main European economies. The crisis facing the country's largest manufacturer, Volkswagen, which may have to close several production sites in its home country for the first time in its 87-year history, now a key moment in the long fall of the coalition. This was the federal government's decision of November 2023, a decision of the Constitutional Court that declared part of the government's budget policy unconstitutional, ultimately leaving the government short by about 60 billion euros. The coalition leaders would then move on to publicly publish a clash on how to fill the 60 billion euro hole in the budget. Now it was in this context that the most recent coalition quarrel broke out last week. An 18-page political proposal document from Christian Lindner of the FDP was leaked, which contained his ideas to boost the economy and reduce costs. Among his proposals were cuts in social spending, a moratorium on the abolition of new regulations, solidarity tax and turnover in Germany, support for some of the most ambitious national programs, climate policies in favor of Europe. None of this is particularly surprising for the FDP given their freedom with fiscally conservative references, but these are really very opposed to the positions of the SPD and the Greens, and therefore, the leaked documents have raised tensions within the coalition. In fact, many have compared the leaked document to a 1982 letter from the then finance minister, also from the FDP, who advocated various reforms at odds with SPD policy, an event that preceded the collapse of the SPD, resignation of Christian Lindner. In the first half of this week, Chancellor Scholz embarked on crisis talks with his coalition partners. Scholz and Vice-Chancellor Habeck of the SPD had warned that the coalition must stay together. Habeck said on Monday, "This is the worst time for our government to fall, given what is happening in Ukraine, with regard to the economic situation in Germany, and with the US election." Habeck himself had proposed his own ideas recently too, including stimulating the economy through large investments, but Lindner dismissed this as a sign of conceptual impotence. In the end, it boils down to fundamental differences between the coalition parties. On the one hand, you have the left parties who want to allow more spending to the SPD, for example, opposed to the reduction of social rights, programs, and the Greens must invest heavily in green measures, and on the other side of the FDP, which demands compliance with Germany's strict budget and debt policy, limits with deadlines that are fast approaching for next year's federal budget. There was not much time for the coalition to settle this dispute. Things finally came to a climax on Wednesday evening with the crisis negotiations collapsing in an obvious way. Scholz then announced that he had fired Lindner, Minister of Finance, saying that it was necessary to avoid harming our country, and that too often Minister Lindner had blocked laws inappropriately. Too often he had engaged in petty partisan politics tactics. Too often he broke my trust. Lindner had also refused to relax budget rules, saying it would violate his oath of office. Now, with Lindner gone, Scholz has announced that he will present a motion of no confidence against his own government on January 15th. As expected, he will lose and cause early elections at the end of March, advancing the electoral calendar from before to now. Political consequences. The collapse of the coalition has looked like this for a long time, and the actions of the FDP are actually perceived as having pushed Scholz to fire Lindner, and there is actually a political calculation here for the FDP. The three parties in the coalition are polling poorly, but this is particularly serious for the FDP, which is below 5%, the threshold necessary to secure any parliamentary seat, which means that they risk total destruction of the next electoral poll in the face of this existential. The threat of the FDP leadership seen looking for a fight with the coalition and finally leaving it as necessary to get credit from the conservatives and business-minded voters is actually our own general policy document that we mentioned earlier was described as reading like an FDP election campaign program. Scholz justified the wait until January for the vote of no confidence by saying that he wants to spend the remaining time trying to get the maximum amount of important legislation through things like the budget and defense legislation that he will hand to the opposition. CDU leader Friedrich Merz for the parliament calls on Scholz to organize elections as soon as possible rather than delay when the election will take place or not on Scholz's timeline or earlier. Conclusion. Signs point to a change of government in Germany. The CDU, Merz's Conservative Party, continues to comfortably occupy the first place in the polls, a position it has held for more than 2 years, while the SPD and the Greens remain in second and third place, behind the far-right AfD having completed 16 years of CDU government only 3 years ago. Scholz faces a very real prospect of becoming the latest victim of the anti-incumbent trend that has swept the world, with Tuesdays marking the most recent example of a voter pushing a party into power with Kamala Harris conceding the election to Trump, a story that has been covered by more than 200 news media around the world. 37% of them lean to the left, while 23% lean to the right. The way they presented this story was different, of course, with a tilt to the right. The media tend to focus on her concession, while those on the left have emphasized her insistence on continuing the fight even after the defeat. These stories are similar in framing, but it's very different now.